Interestingly, what I was planning on talking on this morning was in some small way referenced on the radio. Um, I overheard it as I was preparing my breakfast. They were talking about manifesting, manifesting the life that you want for yourself. Not a usual topic on Irish radio. Um, they actually made reference to the fact that this is something which is and has been more spoken about in the United States. And what the presenter called it was, is this all a bit American for us Irish people? But the topic of attracting into your life and manifesting what it is that you want to experience in your life, it's been around for a couple of decades now. And I suppose, given the fact that we're involved in this practice and this domain of thinking, it's likely that we're familiar with it, using our creative imagination to bring about the circumstances that we wish to experience. I think there's an interesting aspect to all of this, which is the idea of getting what you want. Because what we want isn't always very clear to us. And one of the key components to being able to manifest the life that you want is to have clarity, sufficient clarity so as to be able to actually visualize it. And this idea of clarity is tied up in what we're talking about when we talk about fragmented consciousness, distraction, restlessness. If we're going to be clear about something, everything else needs to be disregarded and put to one side. But as we know from living our lives, all the different hats we wear and all the different roles we play cross over at some point. There's never a clean delineation between one aspect of our life and another aspect of our life. And although we may leave the office on a Friday evening and feel like that's what's going on, we know that we're carrying around a great deal of what we've just experienced into the other aspects of our lives. And so everything gets a bit murky and a little bit more grey. And so, how are we to have clarity in such circumstances? The human condition, and I've been doing a little bit of writing and just being pushed to define the human condition. And we know within Eastern philosophy, it can be spoken about as a condition of suffering, that the body, with its innate imperfection, is bound for sickness and decay, and that this is reflected throughout the natural world, that despite the blossoming of things and the progression and the evolution of things, there's a space which needs to be made for new life to come. And so, innate within the natural world is the making of this space, that there's a creating of a space which allows for new life to come and for change to be made, adaptation, evolution. What's different for us is that we're able to reflect on the whole thing. And so that's what I was doing, was reflecting on this human condition and how, in line with the idea of manifesting the life we want, that we have this continuous desire to achieve fulfillment. We're continuously pursuing satisfaction. Now, in other circles, they might call this happiness or contentment. But whatever way we can dress it up, it comes down to the fact that we are itching, driven by an urge to find fulfillment and satisfaction. Now, there's a challenge in this because, as we've just been saying, what is it that's going to bring us satisfaction? And this could be simply put as what is it that we want that is going to help us to achieve this satisfaction? So, the idea of satisfaction, fulfillment, maybe some kind of lasting happiness, of course, that's questionable, but if we talk about it in terms of satisfaction and the recognition that this is something that we're continuously pursuing, we're chasing after it our entire lives. And even when we think we're not chasing after it, we're chasing after it. It's built in to the whole framework of what it means to be human. We sit down for a meal and we have a plate full of food and we think, well, maybe if I just get a little bit more salt. Or we're sharing a meal and the table's full of people that we know and love and like spending time with, but we talk about who would be our favorite person to have a meal with. If we could have a meal with anybody who's famous, who would it be? So we like to reflect on what it is that's missing. We like to give attention to that. And I suppose it makes sense. And you've probably heard this being talked about in terms of anthropological studies that the human condition is so because it helps to drive us to pursue and to seek out new levels of adaptation or new levels of experience which bring about adaptation and hence our evolution. But in terms of our own lives on a day-to-day level, the same mechanism is at play. We're functioning so as to pursue satisfaction. But if we're going to be pursuing satisfaction, then what is it that helps us to do that? What is it that we want? Now, in direct opposition to this pursuit of satisfaction is an ongoing sense of discontent. Now, there's an obvious relationship between the pursuing of satisfaction and an ongoing sense of discontent. It's this discontent which is the driving force. So again, referring back to research and previous studies, I can't cite any specific works, but something I've read about and heard about, that we are, in terms of our biological makeup, programmed to find lack, insufficiency, so as to pursue and advance. But we need to, as practitioners, look at it on a day-to-day level in terms of what we're experiencing. Because it's very obvious that this pursuit of satisfaction, which can never be met because of a perpetual feeling of discontent, is bound to bring about tension, is bound to cause conflict. And so when we talk about the human condition being one of suffering, suffering is a big word and encompasses quite a bit. So we can also call it the tension of being alive in this human form. We experience the tension of existing as a human being. And that tension can be described fundamentally as conflict. We experience inner conflict. Now, when we're talking about inner conflict, what are we talking about? We're talking about what's going on at a mental level. There's an ongoing conflict, an ongoing tension between our pursuit for satisfaction, and our inability to find it because of an perpetual sense of discontent. In the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali, in his defining the obstacles, or the obstacles which cause suffering, he includes pleasure and pain, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And that's all very clean and nicely wrapped up. It's very black and white. What we're about is, and what the mind is about, is wanting to experience pleasure and wanting to avoid pain. And it makes perfect sense for us. But if we're to understand anything from the aphorisms and the sutras, is that there's a lot more being said in every single sutra than we might give credit. So the idea that we are endeavoring and pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain as being quite simply what's going on is a little too clean cut. And I think we can appreciate this when we start to look at the nature of pleasure and pain. There's pleasure in sitting down and relaxing, maybe enjoying a beverage of a kind or having some chocolates or whatever it is that takes your fancy. There's a pleasure in that. But there is a point when that pleasure transitions into pain, when that pleasure is overdone, saturated, but we don't stop. And it transitions into a discomfort. We've ate too much. We've overdone it. And it brings about pain. Now, that's a very simple example, but it plays out in other ways in our lives. And there's a myriad of ideas going through my head. What would be the most correct or the most apt one in this circumstance? We see people who are involved in well-being, let's say well-being, and maybe they're engaging in activities which is aiming to bring about their physical fitness, keep their body in shape, youthful. And when you talk to these people, people who like running, they'll talk about it as a pleasure. And the person listening to them will say, "What, you ran 10 kilometers? I couldn't do that. Why would you put your body through that?" So for the listener, it's considered pain. But for the person engaging in it, it's pleasurable. But there is a pain in it. Because there is a point when the body suffers as a consequence of what it has been put through. It has to endure. And the endurance builds strength. And this, funnily enough, is pleasurable, but not for everyone. And so the relationship between pleasure and pain it's a complex one. Now, those two examples, there's space for plenty more. We can think about ourselves in relation to when our relationships, our personal relationships. And there's people that we like to be around. It's pleasurable. But when we spend too much time with them, it's no longer pleasurable. That starts transitioning into pain, a discomfort of some kind. I can only imagine that your own mind is able to conjure up some ideas of how this manifests itself. We can even think of it in the professional space where we enjoy a certain kind of work and we give ourselves to it. But then, as a consequence of giving ourselves to it, we burn ourselves out. But then there's another way of looking at pleasure or pain, where we get involved in something right from the beginning, even though it's painful, because it brings us pleasure. You know, you can think of sitting down and watching a TV program. It's horror. Or maybe it's a thrilling drama with lots of violence and blood and gore. Very vivid depictions of pain and suffering. And it brings us pleasure. So it's a very complex relationship, that between pleasure and pain. We know it's what is at the core of our experience as human beings when we are ignorant to our essential nature, when we are clouded by the perception of what we're experiencing within this human domain as being everything, when we're not able to, despite the goings on, stay attuned to our understanding that this is just a play. Then pleasure and pain becomes something which brings about a lot of tension, a lot of conflict. Because where are we to position ourselves or situate ourselves within this force, this interplay, which is consistent in our experience of life? It's helpful for us to maybe reframe pleasure and pain using the terms attraction and aversion. We're drawn towards something and we are averse to something. But what is it that draws us in? And what is it that pushes us away? And you know, the Yoga Sutras, they get into talking about samskara and karma, concepts which are deserving of their own workshop talk, but definitely deserving of contemplation. But we can acknowledge that our psychical makeup is such that it causes us to be attracted to certain experiences, activities, people, objects, things, and avert to others. And that's what makes us us. That's what makes us unique. And we can talk about it with our friends over tea or coffee in the morning, and we can say how late we stayed up watching a TV program, or and then when they question us, what kind of program was it, and we say, well, it was a true crime documentary, and then they're curious about how we find it interesting, and then we stand up for it and we say, yeah, well, it's got this and it's got that, and we at the end we say, I don't know, I just like it. It's what I'm into. And you don't know, but you like it. And I think that's where we meet ourselves. We're at this point of mystery, the fact that we don't know. There's so much to ourselves that we don't know. And it's driving us. And when we're having such conversations with our friends, we can talk about our likes and our dislikes. We can say, I just want to, settle down, have a family, want to find somebody who I can relate to, someone who gets me, and settle down. And yet, all the things that we're doing in our lives are in direct opposition to that spoken desire. And so, at a conscious level, we have it very clear, so to speak. We have an idea of what we want. And if somebody talks about manifesting it, you'd say, well, this is what I want. And we say it, sometimes very cleverly, very articulately, if that's a word, but very clearly. and we'll write it down and we'll give great time and attention to making it a topic of conversation. But then everything that we're doing in our lives is in contradiction to it. So then we have to ask ourselves, what do we want? And maybe what we want isn't so much about what we want at a conscious level, but it's more about what's driving us in terms of what we find pleasure and pain in. And as was pointed out, in what pains we find pleasure in. And so this is the human condition. It's complex. And we think we have it figured out. We think we know who we are. We know what we want. And yet every day we engage in life and we experience ourselves very different from what it is that we imagine. The pursuit of satisfaction meets with the ongoing sense of discontent. And so there's a tension, there's a conflict, and we're looking for answers. We're trying to find these answers, trying to figure it out. And for many reasons, that's why people would turn to meditation practice, yoga, or indeed any spiritual tradition, or anything which claims to be able to explain what's at the core or what's not being expressed within our usual day-to-day world. We're looking for answers. We're looking for a way to overcome this tension and this conflict. A way to figure out why I don't know myself. A way to figure out why am I doing things which are in direct opposition to what I say I want. And we're trying to figure all that out. And we're looking for answers. But as human beings, if we're to use the language of Advaita Vedanta, we can say that we are processing what's going on through our manas, our sense mind, and our chitta, our deep mind. In the language of Western talk, we might parallel them, not exactly, but we could parallel them a little bit to conscious mind and unconscious mind. When we talk about sense mind, of course, we can talk about it in relation to the data that's been processed through the sense organs. But a lot of that data is processed outside of our conscious knowing. While you're focusing on what I'm saying here in this video and this and that, there's so much else that's going on that your body's doing its best to process through the sense organs which are available to you. And then we talk about chitta, the deep mind. There's aspects of that which are accessible. We have memories of when we were younger, of times gone by, experiences that we can recollect consciously and talk about them. But there's a great deal which is unconscious. Great deal which is unconscious. The latent impressions which can rise up anytime and play out. And in fact, they are, or what's occurring at an unconscious level, determines to a huge degree how we experience our lives. And so while we sit down and we say, I want this and I want that, it's all well and good at a conscious level, but at an unconscious level, it might not hold true. And so where does this leave us then as practitioners? Is the goal for us to be able to master the interactions between the conscious and unconscious mind? Is our goal to make everything which is unconscious conscious? I think we need many lifetimes to do that. And it would be a pursuit which would be infinitely bound up, because every time something else is understood, a new impression is made. There's always going to be something that escapes. Always. So the term consciousness and having conscious awareness is used a lot within yoga. I think what's helpful for us is to be able to discern that there's a difference. On one level, the human condition is made up of what goes on consciously and what goes on unconsciously, which determines our attractions and aversions, our what brings us pleasure and what causes us pain. And this is all part of the human condition. But the goal of yoga is not in terms of the human condition. The goal of yoga is in terms of your essential nature, which is the seer. Now, things get a little bit abstract here because we're talking about being and beingness, which transcends conscious and unconscious interplay, dynamic. Conscious and unconscious is pertaining to the human mind and the human condition. Awareness has existed throughout. And so awareness has nothing to do with it. But conscious mind and our capacity to be conscious allows us to regulate what we're experiencing so that we can experience beingness. And what I mean by that is not experiencing human beingness, but experiencing being as awareness. Now, it's fair to argue that it is our bodily mechanism which helps to facilitate all of this. The brain helps to process consciousness. And there's truth in that. Consciousness then allows us to direct our experience within this mechanism so as to know that awareness is what is at the core. So whether this body is here or not here, there's awareness. Whether David is here or not here, there's awareness. Awareness has no personal attachment to David or the body of David. Awareness will exist anyway. But in order for awareness to celebrate itself, to enjoy itself, it uses the body of David and the body of each one of us to have a means to appreciate itself. So consciousness is the apparatus which allows us to celebrate awareness. In other words, you could say having the human form and engaging in life and the manifest nature of life, we have a capacity to celebrate what's at its essence, what is allowing it to be in the first place. You know, things get quite philosophical here. Referring to the word chitta, I referred to it already as the deep mind, but in Samkhya philosophy, chitta is referred to as the field of conscious expression. Chitta, the field of conscious expression. So think of it as a canvas, an artist's canvas. You've got the blank canvas. Well, the canvas is, it can be, it could take on different states depending on where the artist is, right? So the canvas could be uh, totally overloaded with oil paint and fabric and whatever other media has been used to create an image. But all of this can be peeled back, bringing it down to the canvas itself. And then that canvas itself, maybe if we were trying to use this as an analogy, you could refer that to dreshta, the seer, the person, the aspect of us which can see. So the canvas is there, able to witness everything which is being placed on it, so to speak. The chitta is always the chitta. Sometimes it's layered up more and more and more, and at other times it's in its very pure state. But the chitta is there to help us realize and to not just help us to realize, but to allow us to experience being looked at, being seen. And for that to happen, there needs to be a seer. So if chitta did not exist, if there was no canvas, there was no artistic portrayal, if there was nothing there, how could the seer know itself? Without there being something to look at, there's nothing to define that which is looking. So when we bring it all back, what's been spoken about, and we talk about our lives, we can get very caught up with the idea of what we want, what we don't want. We can get plagued by the conflict and the tension which arises as a consequence of our not knowing so much about ourselves, which is determining our experience. Attuning to the one that sees, the spectator, gives us an opportunity to recognize that this tension, this conflict, is intrinsic to the experience of life. It's it's a necessary ingredient to allow for this play to continue. And so rather than becoming caught up in it, our focus is on transcending it. Now, as an add on, I'll just say transcending it sometimes can be difficult if this tension is all consuming. If we're not able to disengage, we're not able to disidentify. And if that's taking place, if we try to find our answers in yoga and in meditation, we might find that the tension and conflict perpetuates itself in different ways. And what would be of greater benefit is to go through a therapeutic process, which will help to navigate this conflict, this tension, which is expressing because of the interplay between conscious and unconscious. I personally support and advocate for psychoanalysis. Yoga is not interested in going through all of this detail. Its interest, its focus is in transcending it. And in transcending it, then we can see that all of this detail and the mechanisms which allow it to occur and the tension and conflict which are byproducts of it are all just part of life. But because we're abiding as the seer, we can appreciate that without it affecting us to the degree that it might otherwise. Okay.